just remembered. Okay, all right, almost have it. So before the emergence of the field of cognitive psychology, like we've talked about, behaviorism was the big popular theory of the day. And so then ideas about how language develops were then influenced by behaviorism. So essentially, behaviorism's understanding of how we come to develop and use language is that it's the result of a conditioning process. So that babies learn verbal language from other role models that they interact with. So parents, caregivers, siblings, etc. And that this learning happens through several different processes. So imitation, copying what they see, practicing, and also receiving rewards. And so in terms of rewards, the idea here is that children are rewarded with praise or affection when they try to produce word sounds or even speech. You might think about any younger cousins or people you've babysat or anything like that. You can probably easily think about that process of, they try to say a sentence and they're automatically worded, oh, good job, oh, yay. Parents might laugh or things like that. So I digress because we don't really care about the behaviorism theory about language because it couldn't account for actually a good amount of aspects of how language develops. And so out of this grew some theories that were part of the cognitive psychology camp. And so the cognitive researcher Noam Chomsky, he developed a theory that really better accounted for language development, particularly in response to this pretty big gap that behaviorism couldn't respond to in terms of the fact that language developed in pretty universal ways in terms of the steps that it takes children to learn, the ages at which they learn that, and that's regardless of culture or even the various logistics of a particular language. So it's not like one language is easier or harder to learn than the other based on conditioning. And so Chomsky argued that people are born with language universals. So that is, they're biologically prepared or hardwired to learn language. And of course, the language that a child learns is going to be influenced by things in the environment. So, the reason why we speak English is because we were born to, if English is your first language, we were born to English-speaking parents, right? It wasn't like, oh, our parents speak English, but, I was able to learn how to speak Swahili or something like that, even though my parents know English. But it's this idea that the environment does influence us along the lines of what behaviorism would have said. But Chomsky put forth this idea that there's this universal language acquisition device. Again, like theoretically, not like a piece of hardware actually in our brains. But essentially what he meant by this was that there's this inborn set of mechanisms and knowledge that responds to the environment that we're in. So essentially the environment controls which language or languages we learn, but our capacity to learn a language is something that is innate. And so this, of course, has come to influence our understanding and the way we go about studying how people develop language. So to discuss language development, we're going to be taking a developmental approach. So we're going to be looking at development from infancy, generally through childhood, and we're going to make distinctions between three different processes. So we have speech perception, we have language production, and then we have language comprehension. And so these are thought to not only be three different processes, but to develop at different rates. But at the same time, they all, as we'll see, they all tend to interact and build upon one another as well. So let's look at speech perception first. So one of the most influential questions that has come up is, do infants have an innate ability to perceive speech, which is coming out of this idea that, well, humans are hardwired or pre-wired to speak. And so the evidence suggests, yes, this is the case. And so in really, really young infants, like a week old, for example, babies have shown greater brain activity on the left side of the brain when they hear language or speech versus the right side of the brain. And this is also the case in adults as well. And so there is this idea that the brain is structured. It's called lateralized or specialized, where certain areas are in charge of certain functions. And that this lateralization is evidence for us being sort of hardwired for language. The fact that we have this left-sided dominance for language. And that this pattern, this activation pattern, is seen in infants as young as even a week old. And so additionally, evidence has also shown us that newborns are able to discriminate between languages that have different rhythms to the way in which they're spoken, such as English and Italian. Even if you don't know Italian, you can at least recognize, wow, the rhythm and pacing of that is very different than English. But infants are also able to distinguish between two languages that are similar in their rhythm as well. And this is the case when they get a little bit older. There was a study that was done in 2001 studying 4-month-olds, so still relatively young babies who were being raised in homes in Spain in which Spanish was spoken, but also Catalan, which is a regional dialect. It's near Barcelona. And so the babies in these homes were able to differentiate between these two languages or two dialects, even though they were pretty similar in their rhythm. And so this gives us some evidence that, again, that babies are able to not only perceive language, but also to start to differentiate between the different aspects of languages. And so also at a very young age, so about a month old, babies are also able to distinguish between various parts of speech. And so first of all, they're able to categorize or identify certain vowel sounds. So for example, infants have been found to be able to tell the difference between pa and pi and ta and tai. And there's actually this really interesting study by Amos and colleagues in 1971, where they used this pretty ingenious, it was both simple and sophisticated to study babies, and the way that they came up with how to differentiate what babies are perceiving was really interesting. So I have a short video that I'm going to show you just to explain this paradigm. It's called a habituation paradigm. So let me go ahead and stop sharing, click some more buttons. Okay. All right, I need this to move out of my way. Okay, so this is just going to be a short clip of a larger video. The resolution of it's not great, so that's why I'm not going to put it in the full screen. So sorry about that, but I put it in the full screen and I was like, I don't know what I'm looking at, and I don't think my students will either. So anyway, here is the paradigm. It's called the high amplitude sucking procedure or the habituation procedure?
The high amplitude sucking procedure is a procedure that we've used for now almost 30 years. It's used with very young babies, and it was one of the first methods that scientists had to try to find out what babies perceive with respect to speech sounds and other kinds of visual stimuli. In our experiments, we use this procedure to examine what differences babies can tell between speech sounds. And much more recently, what we've been looking at is how babies begin to attend to different information in speech sounds and what kind of information that they remember. What we do is we put the pacifier right here in the baby's mouth, and the pacifier is hooked up to a pressure transducer, which gives us an output of the baby's sucking responses. We can tell how hard the baby is sucking on the pacifier.
But every baby sucks with a different amount of pressure, which is assessed using a polygraph machine in the observation room. Here, the researcher adjusts the sensitivity of the machine to tailor it to each infant's baseline sucking intensity and frequency. With this adjustment, the machine registers each suck while letting other mouth movements pass undetected.
Once the baby has established a sucking rate, we start to introduce a speech sound.
Kibad, sabad, sabad, wibad, kibad, wibad, wibad.
But we play that speech sound every time the baby gives a hard suck on the pacifier. It usually takes infants only 2 or 3 minutes to figure out what is going on in the experiment. And once they have established that they're turning on the speech sounds, they begin to suck on the pacifier more and more often, and the sounds come on more and more frequently. Now, as you can imagine, after about 2 or 3, 4 or 5 minutes of this, babies get a little bit bored with what they're hearing, and their sucking rate begins to decline. And when it declines to a predetermined criterion, then what we do is we introduce a new period or new phase into our experiment.
Researchers can either continue to play the same sounds, and those infants would provide information on how they respond to unchanging stimuli, in effect creating a control group, or for other infants, new sounds can be introduced. Now, even 2-month-olds like novelty, so it's expected that if babies perceive the difference in the sounds, the sucking rate will increase, and it usually does.
In order to tell if babies actually remember the information that they're hearing, we usually introduce a short 2-minute period in which we play no sounds whatsoever, but instead the baby gets to watch a series of colorful slides. Then we pick up with playing the speech sounds over again, and if the baby remembers what he or she heard during the first part of the experiment, then we expect that when we change the sounds, they'll react to that kind of change, and they'll begin to suck at a higher rate.
All pacifiers are new and sterile.
So that's an example of how we're able to study speech in infants, even infants who are unable of producing speech. So let's go back to PowerPoint. All right. So another thing that research has shown us is that infants are able to categorize sounds into the same sort of groups that adults do. And so remember that the smallest units of language, units of sound in language are called phonemes. And so infants seem to be able to perceive many of the same phonemes that actually adults are able to. So for example, ga, da, ta, pa, ba, they're able to perceive these and also to perceive that these are different sounds from each other. And finally, there's also evidence to show that babies are able to distinguish between differences in intonation, the ways in which our voices rise and fall. And this intonation then also is present in the stress that we place on syllables when we're pronouncing things. So for example, a baby might learn over time that baba is different from baba. And so there are these differences in intonation and syllable stress that babies are also able to learn and understand. And so since babies are hardwired to learn language, it's possible then that babies are able to learn a lot, especially in the very first couple of months of life. And so the idea here is that, well, then shouldn't babies be able to only distinguish between the phonemes of their own language, right? If we are learning English, we're going to be very well attuned at differentiating between English and the different phonemes in English versus the different phonemes, say, in Japanese. The answer is sort of yes and no. Essentially, it's yes at first and then no over time. And so we know this because there's a study, I mean, there are several studies, but one notable study is one done by researchers named Worker and Pease. And so they were able to show that really young infants who were being raised in English-speaking homes were able to differentiate between the phonemes that were in Hindi. And so again, this is a language that they are not being exposed to at all. And so there are a couple of different sounds in Hindi that English that we don't perceive as experienced English speakers as being distinct sounds. And so what these researchers found was that essentially over time, as children became more and more exposed to English, they had a harder time differentiating between the differences that lie in Hindi pronunciation. And so you can see here, the younger babies were a lot better at accurately distinguishing between, oh, okay, I can pick up these different phonemes in Hindi, and specifically phonemes that are not present in my language. But then as babies kept being exposed to English as they grew up, they became less able to differentiate between these. And so these results suggest then that infants are able to make distinctions among sounds that really early on. So sort of this idea of regardless of what they've been exposed to, babies are pretty good at being able to differentiate the differences between sounds. But as they grow and continue being exposed to a certain language or maybe set of languages, they then start to lose this ability to discriminate and to find the differences. There's a study by a researcher named Kuhl in 2004. And so she was looking at whether infants were able to sort of regain this ability. And she did find that under certain circumstances, they were able to sort of regain this ability of being able to distinguish between different sounds. And so what she did is she had 9-month-old babies who were being raised in English-speaking homes, and they had them either interact with a woman who only spoke Mandarin or to watch a video of the woman speaking in Mandarin. And what she found was that the process of interacting with somebody who spoke a different language led to the babies later being able to distinguish between the phonemes that exist in Mandarin, but not in English. But the infants who just sort of passively received the phonemes in Mandarin by just watching a video, they did not sort of regain this ability. And so, again, this goes to show us that babies are not only are influenced by the languages that they hear, but also the ways in which the languages are processed. I'm kind of thinking back to our levels of processing model. You know, if it's more interactive, it's going to be more meaningful to you versus just like, again, like I said, sort of passively just seeing it, hearing it on a screen. And so we know that there's a general progression of speech production throughout infancy and childhood. And so during the first 6 months, babies aren't intentionally communicating. And what I mean by that is they don't think to themselves, hey, my tummy feels really weird and empty and I kind of hurt. And I think you should know about this, mom or dad or grandma or caregiver, whoever, because it doesn't feel good to me. This doesn't mean that there isn't any communication behind, a baby crying, because a baby does need to make its needs known, right? That is a form of communication. But a lot of what we think is communication is actually interpretation on the part of the parent of, well, okay, you're crying around this time, it's been a couple of hours since you've eaten, you must be hungry. And so at first there isn't this intention behind communication, but gradually we do start to see this. And so at first, crying is obviously the really only way that an infant is able to communicate. And then around 3 weeks or so, there's this fake cry that develops. It's more of it's kind of it's not a cry of distress that is like a cry of like, I need my diaper changed or I'm hungry. It's a different kind of sound. And it gradually morphs into cooing. And so the baby's cooing sounds, they start to expand. They start to become a little bit more detailed and elaborate. It's not just one sort of noise of like da. It's like da, da, da. And it starts to become more complex. And then between the ages of 6 and 12 months, there's 2 major developments that take place. So first of all, the sounds that a baby is able to make, the babbling and cooing that they do, it really starts to sound more and more like their native language, whatever language or languages their parents speak. And also, there starts to be intent behind communication. And so infants tend to start communicating intentionally around 8 to 10 months of age. And so this isn't just language communication, but there's some sort of action that's involved in it. So it's not just saying, oh, I'm hungry. It's saying, I want a bottle. I want you to feed me because I'm hungry. And obviously the babies aren't saying this, but there's an intention behind it, and there is an understanding of that action can take place. Either the parent can give the child something, the child can give something to the parent. And so in contrast to the process of language comprehension, language production skills are slower to develop. I'm sure that we've all seen that in young children, right? They're able to understand a lot more than they're able to verbalize. And so this generally follows a sort of general trajectory. I'm saying general a lot. So this graph that I have here, this sort of average progression is going to be this red line here at the 50th percentile. And the children who are a little bit slower in their language development are in the lower percentile, this yellow line for 10th percentile. And then those who are a little bit faster in their development are higher up here in the gray line of the 90th percentile. So I say all of that just because, and I show this graph because there are some nuances. It's not quite, you don't need to panic if it's your baby hits a year-old and it's like, oh my gosh, they're not saying anything, what's wrong? There is some variation. But on average, kids start to say their first words around 12 months of age, and their vocabulary at this point can range from anywhere to no words to about like 30 single words. They can, mom, dad, cat, things like that. And then language really then takes off around a year and a half of age, or 18 months. And so between 18 and 24 months, kids start to learn that really everything has a name. And they really start naming everything in sight. Again, if you've ever interacted with kids or babysat during this time, you might have realized a lot of their toys and books are aimed at sort of this naming process of this is a cow, this is a chicken. And so their vocabulary at the beginning of this sort of explosion of words is about 50 words. But by the time that they get to about 2 years old, it's really taken off, and they usually have an average of about 400 words in their vocabulary. So a pretty big spike here. And so the way in which children are able to learn words so quickly, or at least the hypothesis or theory of how children are able to learn these words so quickly in such a short amount of time, is called fast mapping. And so this is a process where the child is using context clues to try to make a reasonable guess about what a new word might mean, even if they've only been exposed to it like 1 or 2 times. And so in one study of this, proposed fast mapping sort of cognitive shortcut that kids take, researchers Heibeck and Markman, they showed preschoolers a series of paired objects. So they gave them 2 objects, and for each pair, the researcher asked the child, "Hey, can you bring me, a certain, can you bring me the red toy versus can you bring me the blue toy?" And so the way that they set these up is that in each of the pairs of objects, they had one object that had elements to it, either like its color or its shape or its size, that they knew the children in their study would know. So they made sure, okay, this child knows what blue is, they know what round is. And then in each pair, they had like an unfamiliar word. And so an example was to show the children, this was the best comparison I could find of like chartreuse, which is a shade of green. But one of the examples is that they told the child to bring me the chartreuse one. No, not the blue one, the chartreuse one. And so in telling the children these sort of context clues of not the blue one, which the child's like, okay, well, I know which one is the blue one, so it must be this one. This one must be chartreuse, whatever that crazy word means. And so it showed that children were able to figure out word meanings, even though they had never heard that word before. And even when they were tested several minutes later, even kids as young as 2 years old were able to remember what the unfamiliar term was referring to. So even a couple minutes later, a 2-year-old would be able to bring you the green bowl if you told them, can you bring me the chartreuse one? And so another development that happens around this time of this fast mapping process, where language is really just sort of exploding in the children's vocabulary and understanding, is the use of syntax. And so kids are starting to use grammatical rules around this age as well. And it's thought that this also then bolsters the amount of words and concepts that they're learning at this time. So by the end of the infancy period, around 2 years, most kids are able to use 2-word sentences. And so this develops really slowly, meaning that at first a child might start out by saying like baby chair, and over time is able to then string those together more easily and quickly, and maybe starts referring to their high chair as baby chair rather than saying baby chair. So really this sense of, oh, these words go together in this sort of sentence. And so in addition, some children start to be able to add even more words to these sentences once these 2-word sentences are mastered. So they're able to sort of build on top of their pre-existing knowledge. And here children continue to learn syntax rules. And so one of the questions that's come up about regarding children and syntax is, well, how are they doing this? How did they learn these rules? And of course, there are a number of hypotheses, and none of you will be surprised to know that none of these hypotheses are totally rock solid and satisfactory. So let's go into the pros and cons of these. So one of the earlier hypotheses is called pivot grammar. And so it was put forth by this researcher, last name's Brain. If you're a cognitive psychologist, it's a pretty cool last name. And so he argues that children start to develop these two-word sentences by somehow they first select like a certain set of words that are commonly occurring. And so he called these pivot words. And so these pivot words are, like I said, these sets of words that commonly either start off a sentence or end a sentence. Brain saw that children's knowledge about these pivot words wasn't just, oh, what the words were, but also where these pivot words go in the sentences. And then the other words that were involved are what he called open words. So really the definition is not great, but it's just other words that aren't pivot words. And so essentially here, the idea is that even though it's only featuring two words, there's still this sort of structure that is involved that sort of governs the way that children use sentences. And so here are just some examples, because Brain, his idea was that, well, pivot grammar, you can either have a pivot word at the beginning or a pivot word at the end, same with the open word. But again, these pivot words were specific words that children had sort of learned could either start a sentence or end a sentence. And then they could sort of mix and match these open words in there as well. So they could say all gone shoe. If their mom was putting their shoe on and their shoe fell off the bed, they could say all gone milk when they're done drinking their milk. They could say push it if they were playing with one of their siblings with a toy train or something. And so essentially this idea of pivot grammar was this idea that there's some sort of formula that kids pick up on about structuring sentences. And so, as is the case with many theories, this one has problems. I guess probably not surprising to you all at this point in the semester. So first of all, there's a problem about people were bringing up critiques of, well, how does this pivot grammar then progress into adulthood? Because it doesn't match up with the grammar that adults use. And so there doesn't seem to be this relationship between pivot grammar and adult grammar. And so that's going to be a problem for pivot grammar, because that essentially means you have to do even more to try to explain, okay, well then how does this specific formulaic way of speaking then become this specific formulaic way of speaking? Also, studies were showing conflicting results about whether kids were actually using pivot grammar and that sort of sentence structure in the way that Brain had suggested. And then finally, kids are able to use the same sentence to convey different meanings when they're using these shorter sentences. And so an example of this is a child who, says daddy sock when her dad is putting her socks on for her. And she also says daddy sock if she found her dad's sock under the couch, for example. And so this sort of more black and white idea behind pivot grammar it had some problems when it came to these different observations and also empirical evidence too from the research. And so the next theory that we're going to talk about is called semantic bootstrapping, which I'm like, wow, that was a name that you chose. I mean, it sticks with you. It sticks in your brain, that's for sure. But the assumption behind this mouthful of a theory is that kids are born with sort of these innate categories. So children are born with the idea of nouns. Children are born with the idea of verbs. Not necessarily that they have those labels to assign to them, but kids are able to categorize, oh, okay, that objects or nouns are different than action words that we use. The idea here is also that children just innately understand these sort of linking rules in terms of there is, when we talk about people, you know, there can be people that we talk about that have agency, which means that they are the ones doing the action. And so then they become the subject of the sentence. They become sort of the focus of the sentence. And so again, these children have these categories of, well, a type of object or a person, eventually what we come to label as nouns, or these sort of action words, what we then eventually label as verbs. And so an example of this is if a child puts together the sentence, the girl pushed the boy. So here, the word girl is, she is the agent in the sentence, right? She is the one doing the action of pushing. And so she is then the subject or the focus of the sentence. We have the boy, who is not the agent, right? He's the object. He's not doing anything actively. So he's on the receiving end of the action. And then we have an action word, pushed, in there as well. And so, like I was saying, these different labels of object, verb, noun, etc., all of those very like grammar specific labels, they actually pre-exist within human cognition. We're born with these categories just sort of already set up, and then we start to put labels onto them of, oh, okay, this category, these are nouns. Nouns are person, place, or thing. Okay, well, I kind of already had that category, but maybe I didn't call it nouns. And so again, these are pre-existing categories. And then eventually we learn the specific labels for them when we take like a grammar English class, for example. So again, problems with this. The sort of biggest problem is that the assumption that it makes about what's going to be difficult and what's not going to be difficult doesn't actually happen, at least in the case of English. So in English, we would expect that a child would have a lot more difficulty mastering the verbs that don't follow this sort of traditional agent, subject, object sort of mapping, right? This idea of, well, this person is a subject, they did this thing and they did it to the object. But there are verbs that, actually a good amount of verbs in English, if English is not your first language, you've learned that there are a lot of exceptions to the rules. And so, for instance, it's predicted that, well, kids are going to be better at mastering the verbs push, kiss, trip. Again, this idea of there's someone doing a thing to someone else. And then it's going to be harder for them to understand and to properly use verbs like want or got, which don't necessarily have this sort of one-to-one connection between the subject and the object. However, research has shown that there's actually no difference, though, in the way that children are able to understand and use verbs, regardless of if if they follow this sort of predictable format or not, if they're more irregular. So despite these problems, many researchers would still agree that that kids' speech is rule governed, and we can see this really well in the concept of morphemes. And so morphemes are the smallest unit of meaning that we have in a language. And so most of the things that are left off from words in early childhood are these morphemes. And so as some examples, really frequently the suffixes ed or something ending in d, ending in es or s, or the prefix un are morphemes that children have to learn the rules about. And they tend to follow particular sort of pattern of that rule learning that we're going to talk about in a little bit. But anyway, but just as an example of some of the ways that morphemes tend to change in English. So you can say tie, or you can say untie. And using un, it negates the meaning. You can add an ed or a d to the end of a word, and you can change the tense of it. So going from tie to tied. You can also add an es or an s, and you can pluralize it. So you can go from one tie to several ties. And so children, when they're young children, when they're first learning language, they often use just the simplest form of the words without any morphemes to modify their language. So they might see a girl at the park and go, oh, that girl runs. But eventually they learn that, oh, it's actually, the sentence is that girl runs. I should add the suffix s to the end of this. And interestingly enough, kids are actually pretty sensitive to these morphemes, to these really small changes in meaning. So Santelman and Jezik in 1998, Jezik is actually the man that we saw in the sucking procedure video. They found that kids as young as 15 months old will pay more attention to phrases that have appropriate morphology, that is, the appropriate use of morphemes, like grandma is singing, compared to inappropriate morphology, where the morpheme rules are violated, such as grandma can singing. So kids are able to differentiate between the appropriate morphemes or units of meaning that we add to language, even as young as that's like even less than a year and a half old. And so what researchers have found is that kids' use of grammatical morphemes, it starts to emerge and also continues to be used starting in preschool and then throughout like early elementary school. So for example, when kids first begin learning how to use the past tense of verbs, they tend to use the correct past tense form for both regular and irregular verbs. So a regular verb would be walk, and then to make it past tense, you would say walked. An irregular verb would be taking run and changing it to ran. So at first, children are using these word forms correctly. And essentially what happens though is that it seems that they go from sort of memorizing, okay, the past tense of this word is this sound, the past tense of this word is this sound. They start to then realize, oh, there are rules. There's actually like this sort of rule that you can use every time you want to talk about something in the past tense. So then they start to use these incorrect forms based on this rule. So they go, oh, if I'm talking about something in the past tense, I just add ed to it. So they would say things like, oh, I runned over to him, or I'm sorry, I braked the cup. And so again, this suggests that these children have learned that, oh, these words aren't one-offs, but actually there's this rule, and they make errors with this rule. It's called over-regularization. So it's this idea of, well, every verb that I use, every action word that I use should end with this, should follow this rule, right? And again, if English is not your first language, you would hope that that would be the case. And then you would find out there are a lot of weird exceptions to the rules. There are a lot of weird irregular verbs in English. And then eventually over time, as children continue to try to use this rule and then be corrected, and they understand, oh, okay, there are differences here. There are certain words that follow that rule, and there are other words that don't follow that rule. So they start to learn, oh, okay, so run should be ran. I shouldn't say runned. I runned to the bathroom. That's not how it works. And this also happens with other words too. This also happens when children are trying to learn how to pluralize certain words, like you see here on the screen. So mouses, tooths, leaps, sheep. But actually there are these more irregular nouns that don't follow the regular pluralizing rule. And so children have to learn that. So another grammatical morpheme that's been popularly studied in children is un. And so again, like we saw with like past tense verbs on the previous slide, children, they learn the rule correctly. Really, they don't learn the rule. They just learn, oh, these words like tie and untie, those are two very different words. There isn't anything similar to them. And then they learn, oh, wait, there's a rule. I can just add un before any word, and that means that it's negated. And then they make these errors, right? Because they're applying this rule way too liberally. They're like, oh, well, we can just unbreak it, or can you unshorten my shoelaces? And then again, these children start to learn, oh, okay, there are certain words that have un before them, and then there are certain words that rule doesn't apply to. And generally, children start to learn how to use un-based words correctly by the time that they're in about second or third grade, so around 8 or 9. And so there are also other developments in language production that take place in like during the preschool age. And so this is also an age in which we really see another big increase in children's speech abilities. So during this time, the child is able to really gradually expand the ability to talk about not only what's happening presently, but again, because they're learning the different ways in which to use verbs, that is, they can change the tense, they can use past tense action words, ran, they can use future based words like running, I will go running. So children are able to expand what they're talking about in terms of the verb tense. They're able to talk about things that they themselves have not directly experienced. They're able to also talk about the time-based and space-based relationships that exist between objects and events and things like that. So they're really starting to become more sophisticated in this way. And then also their vocabulary during this time really increases a great deal. And that's both in terms of the number of words that they have in their vocabulary, but also in the amount of meanings that are known or understood of words. So for example, the word plane can mean a number of different things, right? If it's plane, that's like a plane that flies in the sky. If you said, though, a plain cheeseburger, plain, the child would know, oh, okay, yeah, I do want a plain cheeseburger. That means it's just, you know, meat, cheese, bun. That's what I want. So they're able to understand that different sounds can have different meanings based on the context that it's used in. And so finally, their utterances, so the phrases and the sentences that they are using become more complete. So they start to include more what we would call syntactic features. So they would use words like they would use prepositions like the, of. They would use conjunction words like is, and, but. And also there, like I said, there are complexities that arise in their speech during this time as well, because again, they're becoming more sophisticated in their understanding of morphology rules, grammatical rules, vocabulary words, and their sentences start to look and sound more and more like adult sentences. So I'm aware of the time. There was another part I was going to get into, but I think it'd be better if we just save that for Friday. So I want to go ahead and stop here, but I want to check and see if anybody has any questions. All right. Well, like I said, we'll end class a little bit early. Again, so good to see you all. I hope that you were able to get some good rest and enjoy the calm before the storm of the second part of the semester. So I will see you all on Friday. Like I said, we'll be talking about the test briefly, and then we'll continue our lecture on language development. All right, and again, another reminder that lab today is all on Zoom, so not in person, on Zoom. All right, everyone, take care. I'll see you Friday.
Thank you.
Thank you.